Death is death. A person said one time, he said, "That's a horrible way of dying." I said, "What is a good way? Could you tell me what a good way is to die?"
What does it feel like to know you have only 24 hours left to live? Death row inmates have been ruled so dangerous that the only way to put an end to their menace is to put an end to their lives. And as the hands of time count down their last months, days, and final 24 hours before execution, we want to know what their last words were, what their last meal was like, and the final things they saw before the lights went out. Beware, this might get extremely dark as we get to those final moments. So brace yourselves, and let's begin. 24 hours until execution. 24 hours before inmates are executed, they're compelled to sign what is known as a warrant of execution. This warrant of execution allows the inmate to choose the time, the room, the manner, and the certain method they want to be executed. This is important to mention because each state in the U.S. allows different protocols for execution, and only 14 states allow prisoners to actually choose what they want. For instance, inmates in D.C. have the privilege to choose death by hanging. The firing squad is another method of execution that inmates in Utah are allowed to choose. Then there's the very famous electric chair. This one's widely considered to be the fastest route to the afterlife for these inmates because of how quick that execution process is. It's an option for inmates in Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, and Virginia. Then there's also the lethal gas chamber and injection. The gas chamber is still an option for inmates in Missouri and California, while the lethal injection is the all-time favorite for inmates in 33 death penalty states. So, once the warrant of execution is signed, the 24-hour clock is set and the countdown officially begins. 21 hours until execution. The inmates are transported to where their execution needs to take place, which is infamously called the death house. Before these inmates are moved to the death house, they're completely stripped of all their clothes and thoroughly searched for any objects they could use to either harm the prison wardens or even harm themselves. The search is very humiliating for the prisoners because everyone gets to watch. And I mean everyone, both men and women, regardless of the inmate's gender. After the search is complete, a 3-vehicle convoy transports the inmate to the death chamber. But I've got to tell you right now, this is actually the hardest and most vulnerable part of the 24-hour countdown. And the reason for that is the inmate can easily escape at this point. If the inmate has been in contact with the outside world, they could easily hijack the inmate's vehicle and break them free. But to avoid this, the police convoy take different routes to the death house, traveling in identical vehicles just in case the inmate actually had an escape plan. This way, the inmate's contact on the outside wouldn't know the route or car to hijack. But once those convoys arrive at death house, that would be the last time the inmate sees the light of day. 18 hours until execution. Once the inmate is in death house, they're taken to a more relaxed cell than those on death row and are given fresher clothes, like a fancy top and a pair of jeans. Now here, the inmate is allowed to request their last meal, so the chefs can get their ingredients ahead of time. Different states have different rules on what prisoners can request. For example, in Florida, inmates aren't allowed to request meals over $40, while in Oklahoma, the limit is $15. So maybe that's why most inmates just request meals as simple as a cheeseburger and some fries. But either way, this is their chance to have a meal they may not have had in the last 2 decades. And a meal they would love to have just a few hours before their execution. Once they requested that last meal, the inmates are taken to meet a chaplain who prepares them mentally and spiritually for the execution. It's now at this point, inmates can make their final phone call to their loved ones or write letters to their family, cry, laugh, scream, or just do anything to let out the steam that comes with knowing what's going to happen in a couple hours. Once their time with the chaplain is done, the inmates would be taken back to their cell to sleep till next morning. 12 hours until execution. The truth is, most times it's very hard for these inmates to sleep in death house. Some of them just stay up all night doing nothing. Their cells are usually guarded by 2 prison wardens, just to make sure they don't attempt to harm themselves overnight. Now, at the break of dawn, the prison wardens call some special officers within death house to make sure everything's working perfectly and to prepare themselves for the execution. For the chair, the straps are checked to make sure they hold the inmates tight enough not to break free and not to make sure they don't burn out. The gurney where the inmate would lay for the lethal injection is also checked to make sure the straps are working fine, along with the phone that connects to the governor's office, which is actually one of the most important things for the prison guards to check. And why this phone is very important is that even on the day of execution, the inmate has a slight chance of avoiding death, and only that phone call can save him. The defendant's attorney would be trying to file a motion or bring up a solid reason why the execution should be paused, and the reason why this is even possible is that death row cases are treated with caution, just to make sure the government isn't executing an innocent man. So until an appeal succeeds, preparations continue in the death house. 5 hours until execution. With 5 hours to go, the methods of execution are tested to make sure everything's working as intended. For a hanging, the rope has to be directly proportional to the weight of the inmate. The electric chair is tested with wet sponges. The expert shots of the firing squad are handed their guns to get a good feel of it. And the chemicals needed for both the lethal injection and gas chamber are supplied to the house. Now at this point, the inmate is allowed to have their last shower. And of course, get a head shave if they chose electrocution. Now the reason for the shave is that an electric current is passing through the head and leg pieces of that inmate's body. So if the inmate has a lot of hair on either his head or leg where those pieces are attached, the hair's catching on fire, burning the deceased body of the inmate. It's also at this point that the head chef at Death House would be preparing the final meal that the inmate requested a few hours before. 2 hours until execution. After the inmate has had their final meal, the men and women who will witness the execution begin to arrive. These witnesses are usually volunteers, relatives of the inmate, or members of numerous media outlets. The role of witnesses by law is to confirm that the inmate was actually executed that day, and in some parts of America, the inmate is allowed to choose witnesses. When they start to arrive, the relatives of the inmates are kept in a separate room, while other witnesses are kept in another room and are not allowed to mingle. This is just some kind of preventative measure to avoid violence from erupting between relatives and a witness, a scenario that has happened a lot in the past. But once all witnesses are settled and seated in their different rooms, the executioner arrives. 1 hour until execution. With 1 hour left on the clock, an anonymous person known as the executioner makes his way to the death chamber. The executioner is the most important person during this whole process. He's the one that's going to flip the switch for electrocution, turn that gas on for a lethal chamber, cut some ropes for a hanging, call the shots for a firing squad, and administer drugs for lethal injections. In some parts of the US, the executioner is a mere civilian and is paid about $150 per execution. The executioner also cannot leave the death chamber unless the victim is confirmed dead or exonerated of their crime. But until then, the inmate would only be minutes away from his execution. 30 minutes until execution. Once the executioner is in the death chamber, the prison warden and chaplain go to get the inmate from their cell with a 5-man squad, just in case the inmate tries resisting. However, it may surprise you to know that most inmates never really struggle. Once they hear their last names called, they conveniently come out of their cell and follow the squad to the chamber. But if an inmate tries to struggle, the 5-man squad would go get their helmets, chest, and joint pads, while the leader of the squad would break into the cell with a shield and bundle them to the death chamber. The inmate's room to the chamber is usually just a 10-foot walk. But trust me when I say that it feels a lot longer. You know it's the walk of death, the walk of no return. Once the inmate gets in, the first thing they see is the gurney, the chair, or the rope which they're going to be executed with. For the lethal injection, the inmate lays on the gurney while members of the team tie his body down. This also applies to the electric chair. While for the gas chamber, the inmates enter the chamber, get strapped to the chair, and the doors are locked tight. Now the chaplain is usually around the area to calm the inmate down and prepare their mind for the next few minutes. And in a smaller room close to the chamber, the executioner gets ready to end the inmate. The only thing standing in the way between the inmate and death is the hope of that phone call coming in from the governor or attorney's office. 5 minutes until execution. Once the inmate is strapped in that death chamber, and the executioner has prepared whatever needs to be done to commence this execution, the warden is asking the inmate to say their final words. But to prevent the inmate from using that final word as a form of delay, some states in the US allow inmates only 2 minutes of time to talk, while in states like Pennsylvania, the inmate is allowed only a written statement. After the final words are said, the warden waits a couple more minutes for that phone to ring, but when there's no phone call, he lowers his glasses or gives a signal to the executioner to begin that process. Electrocution is the fastest method, usually only taking about 45 seconds to kill the inmate. For the lethal injection, 3 different substances are injected into the inmate. and it's a whole lot slower. While for that lethal gas, we have cyanide tablets mixed up with sulfuric acid inside the chamber. The gas produces a hydrogen cyanide, and it strangles the inmate from inside their system, causing them to shake aggressively, foam at the mouth, and lose their breath. Once the execution is complete, the body's immediately brought out of that chamber or the electric chair for a registered doctor to check the pulse and determine if this inmate is dead. If they are, the doctor takes a note of the time, and the execution process is concluded.
Maybe in some books of justice, the person for this act deserves to die, but do we, as a society, deserve to kill them?